The hour before dawn, December 8th, 1941, 1:27 a.m. Manila time. The air over the South China Sea tasted of salt and gasoline. In the blackness above the Philippine archipelago, navigation lights blinked from the bellies of twin-engine bombers. 53 Mitsubishi G3M Nels and 27 newer G4M Bettys, their aluminum skin trembling under the weight of bombs and torpedoes. Inside the lead aircraft, Commander Takeshi Aoki pressed his forehead against the cold glass. Below, the ocean was invisible. Above, stars wheeled in silence. He had not slept in 36 hours, but his hands were steady on the map. His navigator whispered coordinates. His bombardier checked fuses with gloved fingers. They were hunting the largest concentration of American air power outside the continental United States. And they didn't know if they were already too late. 9 hours earlier, across the international dateline, Pearl Harbor had burned. Radio chatter crackled with fragmented reports. 8 battleships struck, thousands dead, the Pacific Fleet crippled in a single morning. The Americans would be alert now. Every radar station, every airfield, every anti-aircraft battery from Guam to Manila would be watching the sky. But Commander Aoki knew something else. Pearl Harbor had been a sword streak, swift, clean, devastating. What was about to happen over the Philippines would be a hammer blow, and if they succeeded, if they caught the enemy on the ground, the entire Western Pacific would fall open like a door left unlocked. He smiled, just slightly, at the instrument panel's soft glow. They didn't know this victory would be their last taste of invincibility before the Empire's sunrise became its longest shadow. Let's step back for a moment. Not to the grand halls of Tokyo or the marble offices of Washington, but to the cramped cockpits, the grease-stained hangars, the rain-soaked airstrips where young men prepared to write history with fire. Commander Takeshi Aoki was 31 years old. A graduate of the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy, he'd flown over China, learned to navigate by stars and instinct, survived crashes that killed better pilots. His crew called him Tetsu, Iron, not because he was cruel, but because he never wavered. When orders came down from the 11th Air Fleet headquarters on Formosa, Aoki didn't question. He planned.
His navigator, Lieutenant Yamada Kenji, was quieter. A former schoolteacher from Nagano Prefecture, Yamada had joined the Navy Air Service not out of nationalism, but necessity. His family's rice farm had failed in the Depression. He wrote letters home every week, sealed them carefully, never mentioning where he was or what he did. His daughter was 4. He carried her photograph in a tin case wrapped in oilcloth. These were not the fanatics of propaganda posters. They were professionals. Tired, competent, and afraid, not of death, but of failure. Across the Pacific, on Clark Field in the Philippines, the Americans had their own men of iron and doubt. Major General Louis Brereton commanded the Far East Air Force. Over 200 aircraft, including 35 brand-new B-17 Flying Fortresses, the most advanced heavy bombers in the world. He'd been awake since 3:30 a.m. Manila time when news of Pearl Harbor arrived. He'd requested permission to strike Formosa immediately, hit the Japanese airfields before they could launch. Permission was denied, then delayed, then reconsidered. By the time approval came, the sun was high, the morning reconnaissance missions were returning, and his bombers were on the ground. Refueling, rearming, lined up in neat parade ground rows because no one had given orders to disperse them. At 11:45 a.m., the radar station at Iba Field picked up a large formation approaching from the northwest. The warning never reached Clark. To understand what happened on December 8th, you have to understand what Japan was gambling. By late 1941, the Imperial Japanese Empire was suffocating. The war in China had dragged on for 4 years, a grinding, brutal conflict that consumed men, material, and money without resolution. The United States had responded with an oil embargo. 80% of Japan's petroleum came from American and Dutch sources. The embargo was strangling the Navy, the Army, the entire industrial machine. Japan faced a choice: withdraw from China and accept humiliation, or seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies by force. The problem was the Philippines. Sitting between Formosa and the Indies, like a dagger pointed at Japan's supply lines, the Philippines housed American air and naval forces. Douglas MacArthur commanded the islands. His bombers could strike Formosa, the home islands, the invasion convoys. If Japan moved south without neutralizing the Philippines, the entire operation would collapse under American air power.
So the plan was simple in concept, brutal in execution. Destroy American air power in the Philippines on day one. Land invasion forces within the week. Seize Manila, neutralize MacArthur, and sweep south. But timing was everything. The 11th Air Fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Nishizo Tsukahara, had trained for months. Every pilot knew the route, across the Bashi Channel, threading between Luzon's northern mountains, then south along the Central Plain to Clark and Iba. Reconnaissance flights had photographed the fields. Intelligence officers had counted the aircraft, mapped the runways, estimated the bomb loads needed. But Pearl Harbor changed the schedule. Originally, both attacks were meant to happen simultaneously, but the international dateline created a 9-hour gap. Pearl Harbor struck at 7:55 a.m. Hawaii time, which was 1:25 p.m. Manila time. By then, the Americans would be alert. Every airfield would be on high alert. The Japanese strike force sat on Formosan runways, engines silent, bombs loaded, waiting for fog to clear. For 9 agonizing hours, they waited. And in that delay, some wondered if they'd already lost the element of surprise. Commander Aoki checked his watch. 10:30 a.m. The fog was lifting. By the time they reached the Philippines, it would be past noon. The Americans would be ready. Or would they? At Clark Field, the morning had been chaotic. News of Pearl Harbor arrived before dawn. Sirens wailed, pilots scrambled, bombers were fueled for a strike on Formosa, but orders didn't come. Hours passed, the sun climbed, the heat became oppressive. By midday, the tension had dulled into an exhausted routine. Crews broke for lunch, mechanics wiped sweat from their faces, fighter pilots sat under wings, smoking, joking about the war that hadn't reached them yet. The B-17s sat gleaming in perfect rows, 35 heavy bombers, the pride of the Far East Air Force, visible from the sky like toys on a child's floor. No one had ordered them dispersed. No one had dug revetments. No one had scrambled standing patrols, because the radar warning from Iba never came through. At 12:15 p.m., one of the P-40 pilots looked up. The sky was full of silver. Commander Aoki saw the airfield first, a brown scar in green jungle, runways crossing like an X, aircraft clustered near the hangars. No smoke, no movement, no fighters climbing to intercept. His bombardier's voice crackled in his headset. Target acquired, beginning run. The formation descended from 22,000 feet, engines roaring in synchronized thunder. Bomb bay doors swung open, wind screamed through the fuselage. Aoki's hands tightened on the controls, straight, level, steady. Everything depended on the next 60 seconds.
Below, the Americans were running. From the control tower, someone had finally seen the formation. Sirens howled, men sprinted toward foxholes that didn't exist. Pilots raced toward their fighters, but the P-40s were cold. Engines off, guns unloaded, fuel tanks half empty. The first bombs fell at 12:35 p.m. They came in waves, high explosive, fragmentation, incendiary, each stick walking across the field with methodical precision. Hangars erupted in orange fireballs. Runways cracked and heaved. A B-17 took a direct hit and disintegrated, scattering aluminum and fire across the grass. Then the fighters arrived. 0 escorts, 27 of them, peeled off and dove, screaming down from the sun at speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour. Their 20-millimeter cannons tore through parked aircraft like knives through paper. Fuel tanks exploded, ammunition cooked off. Men caught in the open were cut down by strafing runs that swept the field again and again. Lieutenant Yamada, in the navigator's seat, watched through the plexiglass. He saw tiny figures running, saw tracers arcing up toward them. Too little, too late. He felt the bomber shudder as bombs released, and felt the sudden lightness as 2 tons of death fell away. He thought of his daughter. He thought, this is what war is. Not honor, just fire. The attack lasted 18 minutes. When the bombers turned north toward Formosa, Clark Field was burning. Smoke rose in black columns visible for 50 miles. 70 aircraft had been destroyed or damaged beyond repair. 18 B-17s, 53 P-40s, dozens of support planes. American air power in the Philippines had been gutted, and the Japanese had lost 7 aircraft. But Clark was only half the story. 50 miles to the west of Iba Field housed the radar station and the 3rd Pursuit Squadron, P-40 fighters tasked with defending the coast. Unlike Clark, Iba had been on alert. Fighters had scrambled at dawn, flown patrols, searched for the enemy. But patrols burn fuel. Pilots grow tired. By noon, the squadron had landed to refuel. At 12:20 p.m., radar detected incoming aircraft. At 12:30, the phone lines to Clark went dead. At 12:40, the first bombs hit. Iba had no time. The Japanese attacked from multiple directions: bombers from the sea, fighters from inland, a coordinated strike that shredded the field in minutes. The radar station, the only early warning system in the northern Philippines, was obliterated. Barracks, hangars, fuel dumps, all consumed. One P-40 pilot, Lieutenant Boyd Buzz Wagner, managed to get airborne during the chaos. He climbed into the smoke, alone, and found himself facing an entire formation of Zeros. He fired, dove, climbed, fired again, shot down 1, maybe 2, before his ammunition ran dry. He landed on a dirt strip miles away, his fighter riddled with bullet holes, his hands shaking. He was one of the only pilots to engage the enemy that day. By nightfall, the Far East Air Force had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Let's pause here and recognize what has just been accomplished. In less than 9 hours, the Japanese had shattered 2 of the most powerful American military installations in the Pacific, Pearl Harbor and the Philippines. The strategic coordination, the training, the sheer audacity of launching simultaneous operations across thousands of miles of ocean, it was unprecedented.
Commander Aoki landed back on Formosa at dusk. His crew was silent, exhausted. They climbed from the cockpit and stood on the tarmac, breathing the warm evening air. Ground crews cheered. Officers shook their hands. Sake was poured. But Aoki didn't celebrate. He walked to the operations tent and studied the reconnaissance photos being developed. Clark Field in ruins, aircraft burning, runways cratered. It was a perfect victory. Textbook. And yet, he thought about the P-40s that had been on the ground. The B-17s lined up like targets. The radar station was destroyed before it could warn anyone. What if the Americans had been ready? What if they'd learned from this? Victory had a taste. Sharp, metallic, brief. Aoki had tasted it over China, over Pearl Harbor, over the Philippines. But he knew something the cheering ground crews didn't. Surprise only works once. In Tokyo, the news was electric. Pearl Harbor and the Philippines, both crippled in a single day. The British battleship Prince of Wales and battlecruiser Repulse would be sunk 2 days later. Hong Kong would fall by Christmas. Wake Island, Guam, Singapore. The dominoes were tipping. For a few dazzling weeks, the Japanese Empire seemed unstoppable. Propaganda posters flooded the streets, pilots standing heroically, rising sun flags unfurling. the slogan, "Asia for Asians." Newspapers declared the white man's empire finished. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, was hailed as a genius. But Yamamoto himself was uneasy. In his quarters aboard the battleship Nagato, he wrote in his journal, "I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant," and filled him with a terrible resolve. He understood what the celebrations obscured. Japan had won battles, not the war. The Philippines' victory had destroyed American air power, but not American will. The B-17s that survived retreated to Australia. Pilots who escaped would train new squadrons. Factories in Detroit and California would build 10 aircraft for every one Japan destroyed. And underneath the cheering, beneath the illusion of invincibility, the clock was already ticking. Japan had 6 months, maybe a year, before American industrial power turned the tide. The only way to win was to force a negotiated peace before America fully mobilized. But forcing America to negotiate meant winning everywhere, all the time, without mistakes. One crack, one failure, and the entire strategy would collapse. Let's not forget the men who stood in the fire. On the ground at Clark Field, Captain Allison Ind, an intelligence officer, crawled through burning wreckage searching for survivors. He found pilots with burns covering their bodies, mechanics crushed under collapsed hangars, men stumbling in shock through smoke so thick that it blotted out the sun. He also found fury. The American forces in the Philippines had been caught flat-footed, not because they were cowards, but because command decisions had paralyzed them. The delay in authorizing strikes, the failure to disperse aircraft, the communication breakdowns. But the men on the ground didn't break. In the days that followed, surviving P-40 pilots flew from dirt strips, using fuel scavenged from wrecks. They flew outnumbered 10-1. They flew until their guns jammed, their engines seized. Their planes fell apart mid-flight. Lieutenant Wagner, the pilot who'd engaged the enemy alone, would go on to score multiple kills before evacuating to Australia. He'd return, again and again, leading missions deep into enemy territory. The Japanese had won the battle, but they hadn't crushed the spirit. And that distinction mattered.
Back on Formosa, the victory reports were being compiled. Losses: 7 aircraft, 11 aircrew. Damage inflicted: over 100 enemy aircraft destroyed. 2 airfields were neutralized. American air capability was reduced by 80%. It was a lopsided, devastating success. But what the reports didn't count was this: every victory taught the enemy how to survive. The Americans learned to disperse aircraft, to dig revetments, to maintain standing patrols, to harden defenses. They learned the Zero's strengths, speed, maneuverability, and its weaknesses: fragile construction, no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks. Lieutenant Yamada, writing a letter home that night, sensed it. He didn't write about the victory. He wrote about the sky over Clark, how it had been empty of resistance, how the bombers had flown unopposed, how unnatural it felt. The enemy was sleeping, he wrote. Next time, they will be awake. He was right. 6 months later, at a place called Midway, the illusion died. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, were sunk in a single day. The elite pilots who'd struck Pearl Harbor and the Philippines, the veterans who'd trained for years, went down with their ships. The Empire's offensive capability evaporated. But even before Midway, the cracks were showing. In the Philippines, Japanese ground forces had landed and advanced, but resistance was fiercer than expected. Filipino and American troops held the Bataan Peninsula for months. MacArthur escaped to Australia and vowed, "I shall return." The oil fields of the Dutch East Indies were captured, but transporting the oil back to Japan required ships.
ships that were being hunted by American submarines. Every convoy lost, every transport sunk, every irreplaceable pilot killed. The strategic clock was running out. Commander Aoki never saw Midway. In April 1942, his bomber was shot down over New Guinea. He survived the crash, pulled his navigator from the wreckage, but Lieutenant Yamada died of his injuries 3 days later in a field hospital. Aoki held his friend's hand as he passed. Yamada's last words were a request. Send his letters home. Make sure his daughter knows. Aoki carried those letters for the rest of the war. He survived 2 more crashes, malaria, starvation rations on a jungle airstrip, and finally the surrender in August 1945. He returned to Nagano Prefecture after the war, found Yamada's family, delivered the letters personally.
The daughter, now 10 years old, read them in silence. She looked up at Aoki and asked, "Was my father a hero?" Aoki thought about Clarkfield. The burning aircraft, the men running, the perfect, terrible efficiency of it all. He said, "Your father was a good man who did his duty. That is enough." The Battle of the Philippines, December 8, 1941, was a masterpiece of military execution. It demonstrated what a well-trained, highly motivated force could accomplish with meticulous planning and bold action. It showed that technology, surprise, and audacity could overcome numerical and industrial superiority, at least for a moment. But it also revealed the fundamental flaw in Japan's strategy. Winning battles is not the same as winning wars. The Americans rebuilt, they adapted, they outproduced, outtrained, outfought. By 1944, the skies over the Philippines belonged to them. By 1945, the cities of Japan were burning under B-29 raids. The pilots who struck Clark Field, those who survived, watched their empire crumble. They flew obsolete planes against overwhelming odds. They saw their friends die in flames. They tasted victory and then defeat, and learned that both are temporary. There's a monument now near the old Clarkfield site. It lists the names, American, Filipino, Japanese, of those who fought and died there. The runways are gone, overgrown with jungle. The hangars are ruins. The sky is quiet. But if you stand there at dawn, when the light is soft and the air still tastes of rain, you can almost hear the engines. 53 bombers, 27 fighters. Young men who believed they were invincible, who learned too late that invincibility is always an illusion. Commander Aoki lived until 1983. He never spoke publicly about the war, but in his journals found after his death, he wrote one line that haunts: "We won in hours, we lost in years, and the sky remembers both." The Pacific shook that day. The Empire's sunrise blazed brighter than ever, but the shadow it cast was longer than anyone imagined. History remembers the victors, but the sky still whispers the names of those who fought and fell and dared to believe they could change the world.